The first time I heard it, I thought the Vox system was damaged. A low, grinding keen that vibrated through the deck plating of the Forge Cathedral's lowest bay, where they kept the ancient war sarcophagi. The sound was organic and metallic simultaneously, like a throat had been rebuilt from broken machinery and then forced to sing. Magos supervisor Vrel didn't look up from his data scroll when I entered. He simply pointed one augmetic finger toward the thing hulking in the center of the consecrated workspace, surrounded by scaffolding and prayer censers, and said, "You'll grow accustomed to it. Or you won't. Either way, you begin today." I had been a low-grade technician for 11 years before my requisition to the Sarcophagus Maintenance Division. My hands were steady. My devotion to the Omnissiah was recorded as satisfactory across 47 quarterly reviews. I had soldered circuitry in munitions manufactories where a single error would vaporize 300 workers. I thought I understood precision. I thought I understood consequence. But I had never stood in the presence of something that had been dying for longer than my entire bloodline had existed. The war sarcophagus designated Unity 7 Trom stood 9 meters tall, even in its maintenance crouch. Its armor plating was a patchwork of 15 different campaigns, each layer welded over blast craters and shrapnel scoring that had never fully healed. The heraldry had been painted and repainted so many times that the original colors existed only in archive pics. What remained were layers of oxide and soot, punctuated by purity seals so old their parchment had petrified into something like ceramic. The air around it tasted of ozone and rancid oil, but it was the sound, that endless, rising, falling keen, that made my jaw ache with sympathetic tension. "Is the pilot vocalizing?" I asked Vrel, because I needed to believe there was a technical explanation. A malfunction in the acoustic dampeners, feedback in the neural interface, anything mechanical. Vrel's remaining organic eye regarded me with something that might have been pity, though his face had been too extensively modified to properly express it. "The occupant has been screaming since the Hive Fleet engagements of the 37th millennium. The sound is not transmitted through speakers. It is residual, psychosomatic reverberation in the adamantium itself. The sarcophagus remembers its anguish, so it continues." He handed me the work order stylus. The task list was 63 pages long. I was expected to complete sections 4 through 11 within the next 6-month liturgical cycle. Subcutaneous nerve interface restoration, amniotic fluid recycling, spinal augmetic realignment. Each item was accompanied by 3 columns of theological justification and 7 different prayer forms that had to be recited during specific phases of the work. At the bottom of page 11, in faded red ink, someone had written, "He knows you're there. Don't speak to him." I should have requested immediate transfer. I should have cited doctrinal unpreparedness or spiritual inadequacy. There were forms for such things. But I was 29 years old and still believed that faith and technical competence could solve any problem. I secured my rebreather, activated the scaffolding lift, and ascended toward the access panels that covered Unity 7 Trom's sarcophagus core. The screaming grew louder as I rose. Not in volume, the sound maintained the same grinding pitch, but in presence. It filled the space behind my eyes. It resonated in my teeth. By the time I reached the dorsal access hatch, my hands were shaking badly enough that I had to pause and perform the litany of steadying 3 times before I could operate the release mechanism. The hatch opened with a pneumatic hiss, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. Centuries of recycled nutrients, leaked amniotic gel, human waste that had been chemically processed and reprocessed until it barely qualified as matter. Beneath that, something sweeter and more terrible, the scent of flesh that had been kept alive far beyond its biological warranty. I vomited into my rebreather. The filters handled it automatically, cycling the acid away, but the taste remained. Inside the sarcophagus, surrounded by a nest of cables and nutrient tubes and neural interface spikes, was what remained of the pilot. I had seen the archive pics, of course. All technicians in the division were required to review them as part of our psychological conditioning. The pics showed the occupant as he had been before interment, a decorated warrior of the Imperial forces, broad-shouldered and square-jawed, his face stern with the righteousness of his cause. They showed the interment ceremony itself, the surgical process by which a mortally wounded soldier could be preserved and bonded to a war engine, given a kind of immortality in service to the Imperium. The pics did not show what 3,000 years of that immortality looked like. The body inside Unity 7 Trom was no longer recognizably human. Time and cybernetic integration had reduced it to something between a fetus and a tumor. The skin was translucent, revealing the network of augmetics that had replaced most of the internal organs. The limbs had atrophied to useless appendages, little more than clusters of neural tissue wrapped in membrane. The face, if it could still be called that, was a stretched mask of agony, the mouth locked open by the tube that fed nutrient paste directly into the esophagus. The eyes were closed, but they moved beneath the lids, constantly, rapidly, the frantic eye movement of someone trapped in permanent nightmare, and he was screaming. Not with his mouth, which couldn't move, but with everything else, the rhythm of his breathing shallow and desperate, the tension in every visible muscle, the way the amniotic fluid around him vibrated with microscopic tremors. He was screaming with his entire existence, and he had been doing so for millennia. I stared for what might have been seconds or minutes. Then I checked the work order and began. Section 4 concerned the subcutaneous nerve interface array, which required accessing the ports along the occupant's spine. I recited the prayer of careful intrusion and extended my micro-manipulator into the sarcophagus, navigating between tubes and cables. My hands were steady again. Work was always easier than thinking. The first port I examined was crusted with organic buildup, the golden connector almost completely obscured by a kind of calcified tissue. I applied solvent and began the careful process of cleaning without damaging the ancient mechanisms. The occupant's eyes snapped open. I jerked back, nearly dropping the manipulator. His eyes were clouded, the whites long since yellowed to a jaundiced amber, but they found me immediately, fixed on me with an intensity that felt like physical contact. His mouth couldn't move, but his eyes screamed. They screamed with a clarity and desperation that the mechanical keen had never conveyed. They screamed, "Please, please, please." I remembered the warning at the bottom of the work order, "Don't speak to him." I kept my mouth shut and continued working. Over the following weeks I established a routine. I arrived at the Forge Cathedral's lowest bay at the beginning of each shift cycle, performed the opening devotions before Unity 7 Trom, and ascended the scaffolding to continue my work. The screaming became, if not comfortable, then at least familiar, a constant backdrop. I learned to distinguish its subtle variations. Sometimes it rose in pitch, suggesting acute distress. Sometimes it fell into a grinding drone that might have been resignation. Once, during the third week, it stopped entirely for 7 seconds, and the silence was so shocking that I nearly called for a Medicaid team before it resumed. The work itself was tedious and exacting. Each component I accessed was older than most Imperial worlds. Specifications had been lost, remade, lost again. I worked from instinct as much as from the technical manuals, feeling my way through systems that had been repaired and modified so many times they bore little resemblance to their original design. The occupant's body had fused with the machinery in ways that were never intended. Cables had grown into his flesh, or flesh had grown around cables. It was impossible to determine which. Removing one element would kill the other, so I worked around the fusion. I cleaned what could be cleaned. I reinforced what could be reinforced. I replaced components that had failed, carefully harvesting tissue and bone that had grown over the access points, storing it in preservation fluid so I could graft it back when the work was complete. The occupant watched me constantly when I was inside the sarcophagus. His eyes tracked every movement of my tools. Sometimes I thought I saw recognition in them, understanding, as if he knew I was trying to help in the only way the Imperium permitted. Other times I saw only accusation. During the second month, I made an error. Minor, technically. I was realigning a neural interface cluster when my manipulator slipped, severing a hair-thin data cable that connected to the occupant's frontal cortex. The scream changed instantly. It became higher, sharper, a sound like metal being tortured past its breaking point. The occupant's eyes rolled back. His body convulsed against its restraints, and several of the nutrient tubes tore free from his flesh, spraying viscous fluid across the inside of the sarcophagus. I worked frantically to reconnect the cable, my hands moving on pure training, while my mind shut down every thought except the immediate task. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which the occupant thrashed in whatever passed for consciousness inside that prison, experiencing sensations I couldn't begin to imagine. When the connection finally reseated and locked, the scream returned to its baseline keen. The occupant's body went limp, his eyes closed. I sat on the scaffolding for an hour afterward, shaking. Magos supervisor Vrel found me there. He said nothing, simply placed one cold augmetic hand on my shoulder and waited until I could stand. Then he gave me the rest of the shift cycle off, the first mercy I had witnessed in the division. That night, in my hab cell, I accessed the restricted archives. It took 3 forged clearance codes and an illegal data spike I'd purchased from a void trader years ago. I needed to know who the occupant had been, what he had done to deserve this. The Imperium didn't punish its heroes, so surely there was a reason. Surely this was honor, not horror. The records were fragmented, redacted in places, but I pieced together a narrative. The occupant had been interred following the third tyrannic incursion of M37. His original designation was irrelevant. He had been one of thousands of soldiers defending a hive city whose name had been struck from all records after its fall. He had been mortally wounded by bioacid spray that dissolved everything below his ribcage. The field medicae had kept him alive long enough for transport to the nearest forge cathedral, where a sarcophagus awaited. The interment should have been routine, but something had gone wrong during the neural integration, a malfunction or perhaps sabotage. The records were unclear. The pain suppression systems failed to initialize. The occupant had awakened inside the sarcophagus, fully conscious, fully capable of experiencing every sensation of his mangled body, and the systems couldn't be safely shut down to repair the error without killing him. So they left him. They sealed the sarcophagus, loaded it onto a war engine chassis, and sent him back to battle. He served for 2 centuries in that condition before a catastrophic engagement damaged his motor systems severely enough to require his withdrawal from active combat. But by then, his neural architecture had fused with the sarcophagus in ways that made extraction impossible. Removing him would kill him. So he remained, screaming, for 3,000 years. The record concluded with a note from a long-dead tech priest. The occupant's continued service, though limited to ceremonial functions, represents an inspiration to all who witness his dedication. His anguish is proof of his loyalty. May we all serve with such devotion. I erased my access logs and sat in darkness until the shift bells rang. After that, the work changed. Not in its technical requirements. I continued through sections 5, 6, 7 of the maintenance protocols, each as demanding as the last. But in my relationship to the occupant, I could no longer pretend I was repairing a machine. Every cable I reconnected, every system I restored, every component I replaced was an extension of his torture. I was keeping him alive. I was maintaining the mechanisms that trapped him in eternal agony. I was complicit, But I couldn't stop. To stop was to abandon my duty. To abandon my duty was to invite inquiry, and inquiry would reveal my illegal archive access, and that would mean my own termination. Possibly my family's termination if the inquisitorial officers decided to investigate how deeply the corruption ran. So I continued. I climbed the scaffolding every shift cycle. I opened the access hatches. I worked with steady hands and silent prayers, while the occupant watched me with eyes that begged for death. During the 4th month, I began to hear him in my hab cell. The scream followed me home. It resonated in the water pipes, in the hum of the ventilation system, in the spaces between my own heartbeats. I reported to the Division Medicae, who diagnosed me with standard sarcophagus proximity psychosis and prescribed sedatives that dulled the sound without eliminating it. I learned to sleep through the screaming. I learned to eat, to perform my ablutions, to maintain the appearance of functionality. The other technicians avoided me. I had begun to smell like the sarcophagus, I realized. The scent of old flesh and recycled fluids had permeated my skin, my hair, the fabric of my work robes. No amount of scrubbing eliminated it. I was marked, changed. The occupant's suffering was contagious, and I was infected. Section 8 required accessing the occupant's auditory centers to repair a degraded acoustic sensor. This meant working directly with the neural tissue of his temporal lobe. I had to cut away a section of the sarcophagus's interior padding to reach the access port. Beneath the padding, I found something I wish I hadn't. Words, scratched into the metal with something, a fingernail perhaps, before his hands had fully atrophied. Crude letters, barely legible, carved with the desperation of someone trying to maintain their humanity. They read, "I am still here. I am still here. I am still here." Over and over, dozens of repetitions, each one slightly more irregular than the last, until they degraded into meaningless scratches. How long had it taken him to make these marks? Years? Decades? How much agony had he endured just to assert his continued existence? And when had he finally stopped, accepting that no one would ever see them, that no one would ever care? I traced the scratches with one gloved finger. Then I replaced the padding and continued my work. The acoustic sensor repair was successful. I tested it by playing a recorded liturgy through Unity 7 Tram's external speakers. The sensor registered the sound within acceptable parameters. I recorded the success in my work log and prepared to move to Section 9. Then the occupant spoke. Not through speakers, not through any mechanical system. The sound came from inside the sarcophagus, a wet, rasping vibration that might have been a voice. The nutrient tube in his throat shouldn't have permitted vocalization. But somehow, through some desperate manipulation of his remaining anatomy, he forced air past the obstruction and shaped it into words. "Please," he said. The word was barely recognizable, distorted by the tube and by 3,000 years without proper speech. "Please, kill me." I stood frozen on the scaffolding. Every regulation I had ever learned demanded I report this. Vocalization from a sarcophagus occupant indicated neural degradation requiring immediate assessment. But I knew what assessment meant. They would examine him, run tests, document the anomaly, and then they would repair whatever had allowed him to speak, because maintaining the occupant's function was paramount, and speech was not part of his designated function. So I did nothing. I closed the access hatch, descended the scaffolding, and recorded my daily report without mentioning the vocalization. Then I returned to my hab cell and consumed 3 times my prescribed sedative dose. It wasn't enough. I lay awake through the entire rest cycle, listening to the scream that lived in my walls, in my bones, in the spaces where thought should have been. The next shift cycle, I brought a syringe of industrial lubricant, the kind used for mechanical systems, not biological ones, toxic to human tissue even in minute quantities. I told myself I was bringing it for the sarcophagus's pneumatic systems. I told myself I had no other intention. I climbed the scaffolding with the syringe secured in my tool harness, and when I opened the access hatch, the occupant's eyes were already open, already watching me. "Please," he rasped again, his voice slightly stronger, as if practice had restored some small function. "Mercy." I stared at him, at the thing he had become, at the tubes and cables and augmetics that formed his cage, at the eyes that still held enough humanity to beg. I thought about 3,000 years of screaming. I thought about the scratches hidden beneath the padding. I thought about what the Imperium called loyalty and what it called mercy, and the vast gulf between them. Then I thought about the cameras. There were always cameras in the Forge Cathedral's sanctified work areas. My every action was recorded, reviewed, analyzed for deviation from protocol. If I killed him, it would be documented. I would be executed for destruction of sacred machinery. My family would be investigated. The occupant would be repaired or replaced, and his suffering would continue with a new technician, one who hadn't been weak enough to grant mercy. I replaced the syringe in my tool harness without opening it. I completed the day's assigned work without speaking. When I descended the scaffolding, I felt the occupant's eyes on me until the access hatch sealed. That night, I didn't return to my hab cell. I walked instead to the Forge Cathedral's highest observation deck, where you could see the Hive City's upper spires through the reinforced viewing ports. I stood there for 3 hours, watching the distant lights, thinking about falling. About how easy it would be to open an airlock, to step into the void, to trade my guilt for silence. But I didn't, because I was a coward, because dying wouldn't help the occupant, because the Imperium had trained me too well to waste a functioning technician's productivity on something as selfish as despair. So I returned to my hab cell. I took my sedatives. I slept. And when the shift bells rang, I rose and returned to Unity 7 Traum, and I continued my work. Section 9 required replacing the occupant's waste recycling systems, which had degraded to 32% efficiency. This was the most invasive work yet, requiring partial disconnection of the occupant from his nutrient supply while I accessed his lower abdomen. The procedure was supposed to take 6 hours. It took 9, because halfway through, the occupant began to seize. Not from pain, he had lived with maximum pain for millennia, but from hope. He thought I was killing him. He thought the disconnection was intentional. His body thrashed with what little strength remained to it, trying to tear itself free from the systems that kept it alive. His eyes rolled frantically, and the grinding scream became something higher, brighter, almost joyful. He was trying to help me kill him. He was struggling toward death with the same desperate energy that most beings use to flee from it. I worked faster, reconnecting the systems, restoring the flows that kept him trapped. It took all my training and 3 separate prayer forms to complete the reconnection without causing permanent damage. When the final tube clicked into place and the nutrient flow resumed, the occupant went limp. The screen returned to its baseline keen, his eyes closed. But not before I saw what was in them. Not accusation this time, something worse, disappointment. I completed Section 9, then Section 10. Section 11 followed. My 6-month assignment stretched into 8 months, then 10, as complications arose and new maintenance protocols were added. The occupant no longer spoke to me. Perhaps he had exhausted his capacity for speech. Perhaps he had simply abandoned hope. His eyes tracked me when I worked, but they were flat now, empty. The eyes of something that had learned to stop wanting. Other technicians came and went. Vrel retired, his biological components finally giving out after 2 centuries of service. His replacement was a younger Magos who regarded Unity 7 Traum with appropriate reverence and no apparent horror. I envied him. I envied everyone who could look at the sarcophagus and see only sacred machinery. who could hear the screaming and classify it as acoustic phenomena worthy of study, nothing more. During my 14th month, I was informed that my work was exemplary, that my dedication to the occupant's maintenance had been noted by the division's administrative staff, that I was being considered for permanent assignment to the sarcophagus maintenance division, with the possibility of eventual promotion to Magos supervisor. I smiled and expressed appropriate gratitude. Then I returned to my hab cell and lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the scream that never stopped. I have been maintaining Unity 7 Tram for 3 years now. The initial 63-page work order has been completed, reviewed, and replaced with a new one. This one is 89 pages. It will take me 5 years to complete, assuming no complications. Then there will be another, and another. The sarcophagus is too sacred to be destroyed, too damaged to be deployed, too valuable as a symbol of imperial devotion to be simply decommissioned, so it will be maintained forever, and I will be the one maintaining it. The occupant's eyes no longer track my movements. They stare at nothing now, or at something beyond the sarcophagus that I cannot see. The scream continues, but I barely hear it anymore. It is the baseline of my existence. Silence would be stranger. Sometimes I dream that I am inside the sarcophagus, and he is outside, working on me with steady hands and empty eyes. Sometimes the roles reverse so smoothly I cannot remember which is the dream and which is real. We are both trapped now, both maintained, both serving the Imperium's definition of devotion. Last week a new junior technician was assigned to the division. She is young, 26, and her hands are steady. She asked me how I endure the screaming. I told her what Vrel told me 3 years ago. You'll grow accustomed to it, or you won't. Either way, you begin today. She accepted this and began her work. I watched her ascend the scaffolding toward Unity 7 Tram's access panels. Her movements were precise, professional, full of the confidence that faith and technical competence can solve any problem. I didn't warn her about the scratches beneath the padding. I didn't tell her that the occupant can still speak, on rare occasions, though I have never reported it. I didn't explain what it feels like to maintain someone's eternal suffering, to become complicit in torture that masquerades as honor. She will learn, or she won't. The Imperium has infinite patience, and the sarcophagus has infinite need. There will always be someone to maintain it, to keep the ancient war engine functional, to preserve the occupant's eternal service. I descend the scaffolding at the end of each shift cycle and record my daily report. The work continues, the screaming continues. The Imperium's vast machinery of suffering grinds forward, and I am one small gear in its mechanism, turning steadily, faithfully, without deviation. Unity 7 Tram will be maintained for another 1,000 years, another 10,000, until the sarcophagus itself finally fails, or until the Imperium falls, whichever comes first. And every day of those centuries, someone will climb the scaffolding, open the access hatch, and continue the work that keeps one man trapped in eternal agony, because that is what devotion demands. The occupant understands this now, I think. He has stopped trying to speak. He has stopped hoping for death. He has stopped doing anything except existing, which is all the Imperium requires of him. He has learned what I am learning, that suffering can become so normalized it ceases to be suffering. It becomes simply existence, the baseline against which everything else is measured. I will be promoted soon. Magos supervisor is within my reach if I continue to demonstrate appropriate dedication. I will train new technicians. I will assign them to their own sarcophagi, their own eternal patience. I will tell them about acclimatization and duty, and I will watch as the horror slowly drains from their eyes. replaced by the same empty functionality that I see in the mirror each morning. The scream is in my bones now. It is part of my breathing. It is the rhythm of my heartbeat. When I close my eyes, I see the occupant's face frozen in that eternal mask of agony. When I dream, I am the occupant, and the technician working on me has my face, and the cycle continues unbroken, maintained forever, serving the only purpose the Imperium recognizes to endure. This is what it is like to repair a sarcophagus that has been screaming for 3,000 years. This is what devotion looks like, stripped of all poetry and pretense. This is the machine we serve, and the machine we become, and the thin, screaming line between them that we learn to cross without flinching. I return to the Forge Cathedral's lowest bay tomorrow morning. I will climb the scaffolding. I will open the access hatch. I will continue my work with steady hands and appropriate prayers, and the occupant will exist in his prison, and I will exist in mine, and the Imperium will call this holy, and no one will call it anything else, because there is no one left who remembers what the words mean. The scream continues. It will always continue, and I will always be there to maintain it, because that is what I was made for, and that is what the Imperium requires, and there is no prayer strong enough to change either truth. This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is the sound that will follow me until my own interment, if I am judged worthy of such honor. This is what it means to serve. This is what 3,000 years of screaming sounds like from the inside, and now you know too.